I've only seen this raw backlash once before. It didn't scare me enough then. It does now. Alright, so The Last Jedi here. This film has received an unmitigated torrent of backlash and hatred from very invested fans, and they cannot be dismissed out of hand. They just can't. There's a lot of deeply invested fans into this series that know a lot about this story and care just as much as I do, and other fans who have a positive perspective on this film. So it's not worth going into some debate to try to prove them wrong and me right. No, but their concerns are valid, and all I can do is give you another perspective on why I love the film, and I don't think it's the disastrous train wreck that a lot of fans do. And that's all this can be. I can't convince you that The Last Jedi was a good movie. I can't change your mind. I'm not going to try to win some debate. But all I can tell you is why I loved it. Why I thought it was a beautifully profound analysis of the Star Wars mythos from a visually metaphoric, from an emotional as opposed to intellectual, character-driven storytelling standpoint. That distinction between emotional and intellectual storytelling is vitally important to nail down immediately, because this was not a story based on intellectual concepts such as world building or empire or geo, in this case galactic politics, or anything of such grand scales. This is an emotional story about characters, about their traumas and their psyches and what they're going through. This is not Game of Thrones in space. This is not, you're not going to see the Lannisters and the Starks and the Tullys and Marjorie Tyrell and all that. That's not what this story was aiming to be. And I think a lot of people wanted the continuation of Star Wars, the continuation of the original trilogy, to be kind of like that. They wanted to know what the Republic was up to. They wanted to know what the Empire would do now that it's in tatters. Who would rise up? What is the First Order? An insurgency? Is it a terrorist group? Are they a new galactic power? Well, clearly, we'll get into that. And there's going to be a lot of spoilers, so that's right off the bat. If you're going to see this video as an analysis, just don't think that it's not going to contain spoilers. But so anyways, to me, it was a story about how powerfully Star Wars has impacted our culture in the real world, in the present day, which this metaphor was told through the lens of Star Wars itself. It's a story about how Star Wars as a myth, as a modern myth, has permeated our culture today. And I've been saying, if The Force Awakens was a love letter to Star Wars, and specifically A New Hope, then The Last Jedi is a full-on dissertation of the myth of Star Wars itself. So consider emotional, character-driven storytelling versus intellectual, mentally stimulating, plot-driven storytelling. Think about the film that most Star Wars fans regard as one of the best, or if not their own personal favorites, which it's my personal favorite. It's The Empire Strikes Back. If you think about The Empire Strikes Back from a plot standpoint, it had an extremely thin plot where nothing was really resolved politically or from the narrative standpoint on the larger scale. It explored characters rather than the plot. It explored their psyches and their traumas, much the same way I'm arguing that The Last Jedi did. It didn't have ramifications on the political scale or the galactic scale, but it had ramifications, dire sometimes, on the personal and the interpersonal relationships between people, such as Han and Leia. And it's one of the chief reasons people always cite for how Irvin Kershner helped to improve The Empire Strikes Back over A New Hope in terms of artistic merit. Now, I'm not dissing A New Hope, obviously. I mean, that's my second favorite of the saga. But this film, The Empire Strikes Back, was much deeper and much more grand in terms of the emotional trauma and stakes for each character. And here's a quote from him on that very point. He says, "I knew it was going to be a dark film with more depth to the characters than in the first film. It took a few years for the critics to catch up with the film and see it as a fairy tale rather than a comic book." And that citation's linked below. But what he's basically saying is what I'm arguing right there. And this is not something original to me. I'm just compiling this to bolster my point that The Last Jedi, much the same way as The Empire Strikes Back, was dealing with character motivations and character traumas instead of plot ramifications such as, oh, what happened after the Republic? Who's the Resistance? What's the First Order? These are all just backdrops to tell stories about characters in a mythic setting. It's not supposed to be this grand again, galactic political drama of who's in power, why aren't other systems coming? That's not what this was. That wasn't what The Empire Strikes Back was. And most Star Wars fans love that movie, and I adore it as well. And When you accept that you're not going to get these larger answers, you're not going to get these larger ramifications, then you can accept The Last Jedi for what it's trying to be. Now, I wouldn't say that The Last Jedi follows the literal plot structure of The Empire Strikes Back the way that The Force Awakens follows A New Hope, beat by beat, thread by thread. It does, but it actually kind of inverts that, and we can get into that a little bit later, such as the Battle of Hoth being at the beginning, and then the Salt Battle being at the end of The Last Jedi, whatever the fuck the Salt was. Anyways. But it doesn't follow that literal plot structure, but it does follow the spirit of it in that sense that I just quoted Kirshner of exploring the characters. And it was able to tackle these same themes in new ways, which is a chief strength and something that we should actually be very happy about and rejoice and not lament. A big fear of mine personally was that it was just going to be a complete Empire Strikes Back rehash the way The Force Awakens was for A New Hope. And I couldn't defend that, and I wouldn't be able to, because then that's just lazy. This was actually something more daring, and I think that we should give credit for something that was attempting to be original while maintaining those nostalgic themes and the core of what the deeper, subtle storytelling of the original trilogy was. In terms of overall plot, there wasn't much there in the film. So that means neither film was overly concerned with the larger narrative direction. So we can't compare The Empire Strikes Back to The Last Jedi that way. So in that sense, it's basically a wash. So let's compare them on their own merits, the character-driven storytelling that I mentioned. So with that said, recall back to earlier where I said the film was visually metaphoric and that it was symbolic, and that The Last Jedi is a story about symbolism, and Star Wars is a story of symbolism. Now, it's not the best example, but it's one that kind of encapsulates perfectly the sort of larger point that I'm making, and it does it kind of directly in the same visual metaphoric way that I'm talking about. But it's when Rey is being trained by Luke on Yoga Mountain, and he tells her to reach out, and she does reach out. She reaches out literally with her hand stretched forward, and of course Luke is exasperated, and he's definitely annoyed, and he slaps her hand down, and she gets the point and then motions to her heart. While she doesn't say it verbally, she's getting the point. She reaches out metaphorically, and then the Force starts flowing through her. And then she gets her results and she's learning about the Force. And the point here is that we shouldn't be taking every scene in this film from a literal plot thread standpoint, but we should be viewing scenes metaphorically as symbolic of what the theme of the film is, reacting to the theme of Star Wars and its importance in our culture, and view this as a mythic story. I know that sounds bad, but it's actually kind of important, because if you start going back through the classics, you'll have plot holes in every one of them. But they're not telling a story, they're telling us something about ourselves. And in The Empire Strikes Back and The Last Jedi, those stories are telling stories about these characters which reflect about us. That's why we grow attached to them. So to view these nitpicks through the lens of physics, and you're going way past the point. It's science fantasy. It is science fiction by genre definition, but it's always been space opera. I've seen fans literally complaining about The Last Jedi dealing with sound in space, or the physics of hyperspace, or light speed travel, or what the fuck ever. And you're completely missing the point when you go into that, because the point of the original trilogy wasn't dealing with that. There was sound and space in that. It's always been that way. It's always been a story more concerned with mythology than it is with the technicalities of narrative. Most analytic critics cite the hero's journey ad nauseum in relation to the structure of Star Wars, and especially A New Hope. This is merely one aspect of the ancient storytelling tradition Lucas was drawing upon and updating, with inspiration from Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, for modern audiences with modern sensibilities such as the science fiction backdrop. Star Wars always was just a myth for today's modern culture. This is from Star Wars in the Classroom. In mythology, the hero's journey begins with a call to adventure, the first incident on a dangerous path that will separate him from his home and family.
You must learn the ways of the Force if you're to come with me to Alderaan.
Alderaan? I'm not going to Alderaan. I've got to get home. It's late. I'm in port as it is.
I need your help, Luke.
I can't get involved. I've got work to do. It's not that I like the Empire. I hate it, but there's nothing I can do about it right now. It's such a long way from here.
So here's a slide with some academic references for you when you consider these lofty claims that I've made about the place Star Wars holds in modern context as a genuine mythology, not merely in terms of world building like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, but mythology in terms of cultural importance through visual symbolism and deeply seated cultural connections to the ancient storytelling traditions. That doesn't mean the genuine artistic merit of that film is lost, and I believe the same can be said of The Last Jedi and its lofty attempts at dissecting Star Wars culture and the loss of the fans in that process, despite drawing on the very same spirit and tradition of the original trilogy without overtly ripping it off like a Force Awakens rehash of A New Hope. A film does not have to be a literal plot-by-plot sequential series of events that unfold a narrative in real time. It can serve as something deeper that speaks to us through the visual medium of film, rather than the literary medium people seem to be critiquing it from. As I pointed out earlier, The Empire Strikes Back almost certainly draws upon this same spirit and principle, and received, ironically enough, almost as much backlash upon its initial release as The Last Jedi is right now. It wasn't until much later that The Empire grew in esteem. Once people could appreciate it for its rich themes and deep psychological character explorations rather than the overall plot, which again was as thin as the characters were deep. The Last Jedi is much the same way. Once appreciated and understood on these terms, the actual themes of the film become far more important than whether Rose makes sense or why the New Republic was so ineffectual. And isn't that what the prequels did? Didn't they overly explain these politics at the expense of character depths? This is an important point to go ahead and establish and nail down because it means Star Wars has permeated our own culture the way other ancient myths and traditions, such as the story of Moses and the inspirations of Homer or the Epic of Gilgamesh, and how Roman ideals and virtues were exemplified in the apocryphal story of Cincinnatus. And this has gone on forever and ever, and this is a deeply embedded part of human culture and that shared tradition that I was speaking about earlier. Myth about the human condition and experience. Star Wars was, and still is, just our version of that for the modern age. That's what was so brilliant about A New Hope. It was not overt enough to be immediately understood and reconciled, but it was subtle enough that it entered our own psyche and understanding because these stories have been important parts of culture for many generations and epochs and eras. So as you can see here with the photo slide here, these aren't direct correlations visually, but this sort of mythic overtone there with Obi-Wan versus Vader. And it just draws upon this epic storytelling. I don't mean epic in terms of, oh my god, awesome. I mean epic in terms of structure and importance. Star Wars, the original trilogy. An interwoven tapestry of mythic stories examining the human condition and spirituality, especially Eastern traditions of Buddhism and Taoism. Remember all of Yoda's profound insight of the Force in The Empire Strikes Back? The story we all universally love and admire? Yeah, he was talking about that. Or Palpatine's rise to power in the prequel trilogy being some version of a Roman coup d'etat. These deeper themes have always been present in Star Wars, so let's move on to The Last Jedi and its themes with that point finally firmly established, I hope. Recall back to my first point. Luke telling Rey to reach out metaphorically instead of literally reaching out with her hand. Yes, that was a joke. It really was. But it still perfectly exemplifies the symbolic theme of the film. The theme of the film, one of them, is symbolism itself. Symbolism is rampant throughout the film in a multitude of ways, through literal dialogue, through the plot, the narrative. The last remaining rebels are the symbols of hope themselves to the galaxy, and I mean this is referenced, and also through visual metaphor and meta-textual analysis of what Star Wars means to us as a symbol in real life culture. It pervades every aspect of modern society to such lengths as Ronald Reagan calling his missile defense program Star Wars, and these cultural references are deeply embedded into everyday society in such a profound way. Ask anybody who Darth Vader is, most know, even old grandmas and little boys. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's actually review how The Last Jedi conveys the theme of symbolism instead of just asserting that it does. In this particular analysis, we'll focus on how this message is displayed visually, since most references through dialogue will be overt enough to be plainly obvious, almost by definition. Instead, let's look at how actual symbols are used in the narrative to demonstrate to the in-universe characters the power such symbols can carry, as well as more subtle uses from the metaphorical standpoint I keep rambling about. So number one, let's look at Rose's other half of the medallion. This is the medallion that her sister had in the beginning when she made that sacrifice, and then Rose has the other half that she cherishes, and this is referenced through the dialogue, and it's fucking part of the story. But it's a symbol of her sister and her sacrifice, and is also doubly symbolic of the Taoist yin and yang, so we have an even more deeply subtle symbolism within symbolism. It's also used to symbolize the good intentions hidden under the roguish exterior, with Benicio del Toro's character using it as a conductor. And then because this film has shades of being morally gray, 50 shades of morally gray, their trust is betrayed despite this symbolic usage. Then also here in this slide, you'll see that in the Jedi Temple where Rey is learning, you can see the Taoist yin and yang is also the symbol of the Jedi underneath that shallow pond. Han Solo's dice represent him as a character. He was a gambler, a free spirit, the lovable rogue. Remember, he won the Falcon in a card game against Lando, and think about how inexorable the Falcon is to his personal experience. Han's dice symbolize to Leia that no one is ever truly gone, just as Luke Skywalker says, which serves as the beautifully subtle meta-symbolism of Carrie Fisher living on with us forever in the real world in these films, as well as Han Solo being remembered in universe as a beloved friend. These same dice are picked up by Kylo later, who is now realizing with his increased power comes increased isolation, and those same dice disappear in his hand as he makes his last desperate Force connection to Rey, who literally closes a door on him as they disappear in his hands. Again, physical symbols, Han's dice being symbolic of him, representing metaphorical symbolism, Rey, Luke, Han, Leia, everyone in his life fading away. So I hope you can appreciate how this theme reinforces itself through the multiple uses that stack and build upon that foundation. Alright, so then we have Rey's beacon, which is fairly obvious, but it's still there, and it's worth pointing out. And there's some lines of dialogue about the hope and who carries the hope and all that stuff. So it's there, it's just worth pointing out, and keep that in mind next time you see the film. Then we have Rose's resistance ring, which is it's first used to show the little boy in the stall, in that animal stall, that they are not part of the First Order. But then later on, it's used to beautiful effect in that amazing ending, showing that we can find inspiration in symbols, as he is actually wearing it as he looks up at the stars and turns that broom into the backdrop of a sword, showing us that it is not who you are, but what you do that matters. And this ending couples back perfectly with my first few paragraphs about how stories inspire us, and how stories of Luke Skywalker inspired that fictional character the way stories of Luke Skywalker inspired us in real life.
I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to rescue you.
In your first step into a larger world.
And so the film itself is symbolic of the place Star Wars as a series holds as a myth in the larger cultural context of society, or at least since the series' inception in the modern era. More than any other entry in the series, The Last Jedi is a film about Star Wars itself and its own mythology and the large mythology in culture. A major theme of the entire film is symbolism itself, and how it achieves this is a remarkable stroke of storytelling. No, it's not plot development, not Game of Thrones in space, but this is more like the Odyssey in space. Also, very briefly, if somebody wanted to argue that the sacred Jedi texts displayed in the film are symbolic or metaphorical of the sacred original trilogy, Star Wars itself, then that would be valid, and I think that'd be a fine interpretation. And then if somebody wanted to add the negative spin that Yoda destroying them, or even Luke's willingness to destroy them the way that they are, is somehow indicative of the new trilogy shitting all over the old trilogy, literally burning it to the ground, that would be a valid interpretation along the same lines that I'm arguing. It would be a negative one, and people could have a negative reaction to that because of their attachment to Star Wars, but it would still be a valid interpretation and depth to the film that isn't readily available on the surface. It's not wrong, it's just negative in terms of emotional impact, which is fine. And besides, either way, at the end, they show that Rey is still holding those sacred Jedi texts. The Spirit is still with us, so that would be my positive spin on it at the very end. One potential interpretation of the connection and totality between these symbols is the idea of attachment and the power it can hold. Rose's attachment to her sister, Luke and Leia's attachment towards Han, symbolized in the dice, Kylo's attachment to his slain father, symbolized by his conflicted psyche and those fading dice. We saw how dangerous attachment was to the Jedi philosophy in the prequel trilogy, which Luke briefly mentions during one of his lessons with Rey, but I think a subtle inversion of the traditional caution towards attachment is that Ben Solo is clearly falling deeper into the dark side as he systematically destroys each of his attachments over the course of his arc, which is why when he reaches out towards Rey, both through the Force and literally in the throne room, he seems to have a sincere desire to connect. Hell, as he holds outstretched hand to Rey in the throne room, he literally at one point flat out begs, "Please," and in an overtly pleading tone. It's clear he desperately wants attachment, but his path is leading him towards destroying that attachment, thus reinforcing the dark side, which leads towards more destruction, and so on and so forth, etc., etc. So rather than the lack of attachment being what keeps a Force user stoic and balanced, we are seeing the full failure of the Jedi philosophy first personified with Anakin Skywalker, and now with Ben Solo. This is another subtle aspect of his connection to Vader that isn't merely as superficial as wearing a mask. And finally, let's reference the meta-textual aspects. This could apply to fans' attachment to Star Wars itself as well. It goes without saying that there are a vast number of fans who are deeply invested in this series. Hell, one of them is talking right now and is making this video. So those are just a few points about only one of the themes of the film. There are still more, such as the B-plot with Finn and Poe and Rose conspiring their little clandestine plan under Dr. Ellie Sattler's nose to sneak aboard the Star Destroyer to disable the tracker because Poe felt Sattler's motives were either ineffectual or traitorous. This theme examines the nature of command and Poe's inability to accept the hierarchy of orders, not the patriarchy, well, that's a whole other video, but the hierarchy of orders and command, and is referenced and mirrored in perspectives between Finn, Poe, and Dr. Sattler compared to Hux, Snoke, and Kylo on the other side. Think about Kylo's rivalry with General Hux, how he reaches out and sees his power. And then think about Dr. Ellie Sattler's hiding the true plan because she felt Poe's rank and role didn't warrant that kind of clearance. Poe's trigger-happy nature being demonstrated in helping formulate that clandestine elite master hacksaw plan, and the ended up irrelevancy of this plan is actually the turning point in his character arc. The plan was useless in universe, and that was the point, and why it feels useless in the story. Because it actually is useless, from even the narrative standpoint, yes, but not from a character development standpoint. This was all from a B-plot most fans have derided as useless. It's useless in terms of narrative, but this isn't a narrative-driven film. It's a psychologically character-driven film, like The Empire Strikes Back. And that B-plot perfectly encapsulates those themes as well. And there are still a lot more. Time to die, Ben. Nah, but seriously, do you think Leia and do you think Holdo, do you think they had something going on maybe? Is there anything there to that? Nah, but another theme of this film is failure, which is ironic because a lot of fans are saying this film is a failure. And another theme is the loss of idealism, which is referenced again meta-textually because of our loss of idealism for Star Wars itself. People have literally said that this film ruined their childhood. Do you think Luke's failure with Ben ruined his formative experiences? Or rather, his perception of those former experiences as he is now? His youthful idealism for adventure, the trust in the Jedi way, faith in himself as this legendary hero. Well, hell, he flat out says it does in dialogue within the actual film itself. This is an in-universe example of the larger real-world perception of Star Wars lately. Remember when Luke was about to kill Darth Vader in Return of the Jedi, and he has that moment of introspection, and he takes that long look at his hand, and sees Vader's hand and realizes the mistake that he's about to make, and he changes his mind in an instant? Now think about The Last Jedi, and that moment that we see repeated where Luke was about to kill Ben, or at the very least had the thought of doing it. He takes that moment of introspection, looking at the green lightsaber again, which I referenced here visually, and he changes his mind. But the consequences were made, just like they were made before in Return of the Jedi, where when he lets Vader live, the Emperor flat out says, "Now you will die." The choice is made, the die is cast, there is consequence. And this time there was consequence that he couldn't be saved from. Remember, when The Empire Strikes Back was first released, it received mixed reviews and downright negative reviews from some critics. They didn't like that it was this middle-of-the-road story where nothing really happens, the plot was extremely thin, nothing really goes on, and somebody called it even Wagnerian pop. So now we're seeing a lot of the same criticisms leveled at The Last Jedi for nothing really happening, or it was middle of the road, da-da-da-da-da. I can't convince you this film was amazing, and you aren't even unjustified in your opinions or criticism. Different perspectives are extremely important, but I hope this long-ass analysis of some of the reasons why I personally love the film can help you appreciate the numerous subtleties, themes, character explorations, and the symbolism involved with the film and why it was beautiful to me, if only me. This is not a debate to win, but this was just an exploration of why I personally love the film, and maybe there's others out there like me, and if there are, share this video with your friends and your family and other fans so that maybe they can help understand why we love the film as well. Every story, every hero, every theme, told 1,000 times to 1,000 new fans for 1,000 years. This is always what Star Wars was, the modern myth. This analysis is just part of that process, and for 1,000 more years to come, we'll be doing the same. So if you made it to the end here, thank you so much for watching, and if you think you know anybody who might find some value in this video at all, by all means, please share it, and let's get the word out that this film is a little bit deeper than a lot of the haters are giving it credit for. So have a great 2018, and hopefully there's better Star Wars films to come for all the fans, and it's not so polarized. So thanks again, and take care.